Jay, I just first and foremost want to thank you, obviously, for making the time. I'm really excited for this.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's not like we have any shortage of things to talk about, you and I, whenever we talk. So.
Yeah, Jay and I, we've had enough one-on-one Zoom calls. And so I'm going to let Jay do a proper intro on himself in a second. But I think the common thread, if there's any thread in this conversation, is just going to be about like continuing to do work that feels very original and meaningful to you in a world that sometimes may pull you in other directions. Jay is an amazing thinker on this topic and many more. But Jay, I guess my first question is, when people ask you what you do, what do you tell them?
It's funny. So my wife is very humble, does not like to be the center of attention. I would have worn the wedding dress if I looked at all good in it. That's how much she does not like to be in the center of attention, and I quite enjoy it. And so she says, oh, I'm a psychologist, and I'm like, no, you have a PhD, you have your own lab at Tufts University, like you are awesome, like everybody knows she is awesome. And then people go, wow, that's awesome. Then they turn to me. So what do you do? And I'm like, are you an internet worker? Because if so, you'll understand. But if not, probably not. So what I've really, truly, and I'm not pandering because this is Foster, what I've really boiled it down to is I just say I'm a writer. And if people want to ask more questions, fantastic. If their eyes glaze over and they're not interested, fantastic. Because I've saved them a lot of pain of me being like, so I'm a writer and a public speaker. I've done some books and some documentary series and a lot of podcasts, both for clients and for myself. I run a community group for content creators, and I'm kind of like generally doing a lot of internet side projects at all times. I guess kind of maybe I'm a marketer, and by then they're like looking for ways to get out the door. So like it took a lot of gumption, honestly. It was like years in the making for me to just look somebody in the eyes because, I didn't have the book deal. I didn't have the big platform. I didn't have this stuff, and just say to them, yeah, I'm a writer, and let that be enough.
I love that so much because my own version of that came actually after doing Rite of Passage with, at least Amanda was a fellow alum in my cohort. And one of the exercises was answering the question, or I chose to answer the question, what do you do? And for me, it was really interesting. I landed on like, oh, I guess I'm like an entrepreneur, but I've always like shuddered at the idea of claiming that title. And there's a lot of like misunderstandings around it. And I had a lot of like ego issues of like, does that really capture the unique snowflake that I am? But I'm like, you know what? That's probably just like the simplest answer for what I am. And I've felt a lot of insecurity around finding a definition for what I do because it has felt kind of expansive.
One thing I've tried, which, it does take the right audience. I'm probably not going to say this to somebody's parents over dinner, but like, if it's unclear if it's a professional setting or it's definitely a professional setting, I'll just start saying, well, I make things to help other creative people create better work. Right. And it's like, primarily that means writing. And, that's a little bit less succinct, of course, but like the reason I do the work leads more so than what I'm making, that classic couching of like why, how, and what. We tend to start by just saying, what do you do? Right. But like why I do it it supersedes it. It's what moved me from writing to podcasting and from podcasting to videos and documentaries and, writing blog posts to books. It's like the vehicle for delivering ideas and stories and value matters a little bit less to me than why I'm doing it.
Yeah. What do you but maybe I should say you have, I think, a very clear vision for yourself, which I find really inspiring and compelling. And you just shared some of it, really helping other folks who share ideas to be able to do that effectively. But I've also heard you kind of describe this vision of you're basically doing the Anthony Bourdain for business.
That's my shorthand. That's shorthand. my grand aspiration / delusion.
Yeah. Well, I love it because I always think of Bourdain as this amazing storyteller, this like just this seeker, and so I kind of see that in your work. But I guess how did you land on this vision for yourself? And, how would you encourage people to maybe think about their own?
Yeah, I don't know if this is because, my parents were very supportive. I think a lot of creativity is born when people are saying to you at a young age, like, hey, I liked that, or you did that well, or you're good at this. And you go, well, I like that feeling, so I'll do it again. Right. I view creativity as it's practice. It's repetition plus reinvention over time. Like you do a version, then you make it better, and that plays out over the long arc of time. So what gives you maybe an advantage is if people early on in school or in your personal life are like, great job on this thing you did, Stu, which is probably like some doodle of a, in my case, like a snake that I had named Sammy. I would like create a little book about Sammy the snake. And my parents would be like, yay, that's awesome. And I'd be like, wow, I feel good. So I will do more. Right. And so because I started putting in the reps sooner than another timeline version of myself, right, maybe I'm better for it. And so I think like that practice approach drives everything that I do. And so like, that's why I say to people, I want to help you make what matters most. Like that is my North Star. The Bourdain of business thing is me being delusional, being aspirational, however you want to slice it. A friend of mine jokes like maybe a synapse doesn't fire right in my brain, where I see his work and I'm like, I am so inspired. I want to make stuff like that. Instead of like the healthier reaction perhaps is, oh, I could never, right? Like that's amazing. I'm glad that exists, but like, I can't do that. It's like, no. Like I'm a delusional person. And I think that's actually useful for creatives and entrepreneurs. And I'm saying, I want to bring that stuff to the business world, because in the workplace, we have so much of the entire spectrum of the human experience or human emotional spectrum is bottled up in work. It's a microcosm of everything about the human condition. We draw meaning from our work. We make connections through our work. We change the world through our work in big and small ways. And the content about the workplace is like shouty talking heads discussing Elon Musk and Bitcoin, or Facebook, Apple, Amazon, and Google. Vapid Instagram influencers posting like nice follow your dreams, self-actualization crap, and lots of like frenetic keeping up with the Joneses or webinar bro kind of bullshit. Like we need Bourdain like storytelling and nuance and investigations and explorations in this world. So like maybe I'm crazy enough to raise my hand and be like, I'll try that. I'd like to do that. Yeah, so it's my North Star. Sometimes it feels as far away as the North Star. And then there's those blissful moments where I'm like, I made something and it kind of feels emblematic of that, but it'll drive me for as long as I'm allowed to make stuff on the internet.
This is beautiful, a beautiful setup to really the topic that I was excited to explore with you, which is like, there does seem to be this deep disconnect between what ends up really being important and valuable as far as like creative work and what ends up getting attention on a lot of platforms. We could pick on Twitter specifically. But maybe I'll frame the question a couple ways. So one is obviously you've worked with, it's funny, you've worked with a lot of marketers, although I don't from the outside consider you a marketer. And I see so much of what you share to be directly relevant for online writing and, building kind of a presence as a writer. So I guess like one thing in the marketing world or maybe in the online writing world, what are some of those best practices and like common tropes that you find yourself disagreeing with or just having a very different perspective on that kind of drive how you approach your own work?
Yeah. I mean, I could cite endless symptoms of probably the same illness, right? Like the cheats and hacks and yet another interview podcast with B2B experts in this niche. And like, it's just, we all recognize what that stuff is, especially if we occupy roles like that, whether you're an engineer or you're in HR or you're like me in marketing. But I got into marketing because someone said, hey, you can create really interesting things that move you and move others in this job. So I showed up for work. Like I didn't get into marketing because I love distribution or analytics or all these things, but it turns out like one of the missing pieces is like the actual core, the beating heart of all this stuff is to create great experiences, is to say something that matters to the world and go deeper in a world trending shallow. And then it gets easier to distribute your work or to find a small audience that reacts in a big way as signal you should keep going instead of looking for immediate virality and all these top line numbers that we all hunt for. So I think that the illness is, I go back to this idea of Goodhart's law. So Goodhart's law says that when the metric becomes the goal, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm simplifying some of the academic language, but when the metric becomes the goal, it ceases to be a good metric. So I've worked for software companies where the goal was grow the blog 50%, drive 5,000 leads this month. That's not a goal. Those are not goals. Those are how we measure our progress towards the goal. So what is the actual goal? Well, it's going to sound like some version of make a difference, right? It's like, I'd like to, show the world how fun and relevant I am through my tone of voice. I'd like to create the world's most impactful and inspirational and entertaining blog for podcasters. I want to take the next 30 days and solve these 5 problems for my audience of HR professionals. Like, those are actual goals, and how we measure the progress towards it now sounds like grow the blog 50% or increase subscriptions or lead gen and things like that. So we kind of lose the script is where I'm going with this answer. We lose the script of what the work is for. And I think that causes us to retreat to short-termism and hacks and sheets and whatever will work in air quotes and all these sort of self-proclaimed best practices, which, by the way, just mean a possibility. Doesn't mean it's the best practice or the best approach for you, which is the actual goal. So it's when we lose sight of what the goal is, which has to be some version of make a difference. And then, as you can tell, I get on my soapbox and get frustrated with marketing.
Yeah, it's funny. I've my co-founder Dan and I have had a lot of conversations about like one of the things that gets lost in the context of like being an online writer or growing a presence on Twitter is like, one of the best quote unquote hacks is like actually doing something interesting in real life, actually really having something to say. It's like, I wish I could think of a less controversial figure, but like Elon Musk doesn't have tens of millions of followers because he has the funniest memes. He has that sort of reach and audience because like the guy is involved in some pretty interesting projects and has a pretty unique worldview that, agree, disagree, and indifferent or whatever, is very like alluring. And I think like foundational for everything he does. So again, for the love of God, I wish I could think of a better example because he's so whatever,
Well, take any craftsperson, take a musician, take, Bourdain, take anybody who, maybe touches on celebrity in some fashion or not, like some micro, community group that the person leading the charge can say, hey, I'm doing this thing this weekend, or I'm moving over to this channel, and whoosh, like everybody that they care about serving follows them there. Right. It's like my dream would be to never have to use social media ever again, to just do things that sure people might talk about on social media, but I'm not doing I'm not here to be good at social media. I'm here to be good at the actual work.
Yeah, I guess that's like a great segue into something you brilliantly tweeted. I think this thread is now a fight for the soul of the internet, about specifically Twitter threads. And I loved how you kind of parse this out, but I won't read all your words back to you, but the gist of it was basically like, Twitter threads truly are very often this vapid, self-aggrandizing, transparent, like attempt at gaining attention. And obviously I'd love to parse some of this now because,
sure.
But I think your basic, one of your real core ideas was like when you kind of write for the platform, you just fundamentally have a different lens on and filter the world differently than maybe if you wrote elsewhere or had a kind of a different set of incentives. But anyways, I'm interested to kind of get your take on how writing kind of natively on some of these platforms can really lead you astray. We have popcorn emojis in the chat, so let's get into it.
Yeah, sure. And I apologize to folks live. My video's on delay. Is my audio right up to speed, Stu?
There's a slight difference. I'm able to hear you fine.
Okay.
There's maybe like
cool.
a second lag, but yeah, I'm
cool.
good.
I'm hoping this catches up here on a rainy day in my brand new home here. Just installed the Wi-Fi. So yeah, I mean, there's a few ways you can look at this. So the first is the intention being to develop your writing skill. And I think, well, the punchline to all this stuff, Stu, is honestly, we just need to know what it is. What are we doing? What are we walking into? Let's walk in eyes wide open. And then given those variables, if we still say, yeah, I want to write some Twitter threads, great, go for it. So the first is I'm going to use Twitter threads as a replacement for a Word document, a Google document, Squarespace, WordPress, a blog, Medium, a LinkedIn blog post even, although that's getting closer to Twitter threads. I'm going to use this to develop my writing skill. Okay, but if you're writing a script for a narrative podcast, you are getting good at writing a script for a narrative podcast because there are certain constraints that you have to have in mind. Now, does some of that transfer over to other types of writing? Absolutely. It's more left to chance, but just know what you're getting good at doing. When you're writing Twitter threads, you're getting good at writing in 280 character bursts, which by the way, have to be really hooky. They just by nature of where you're publishing and trying to get people to continue on, and you're sucking up a lot of characters, essentially encouraging people or incentivizing or intriguing them enough to get them to the next 280 character burst. So what you're doing well is you're getting good at being hooky. What you're doing poorly is getting good at explaining things with nuance and really going deep, even though threads are deeper than a single tweet. You know, you're losing out on the layout and the formatting of writing and what that can do to understanding, and certain levels of emphasis and stuff like that. So that's one problem. The other one, which is as insidious, if not more so, is the fact that you're writing essentially on a platform driven by an algorithm. And so we're human. We're going to look at what worked and what got engagement. And then we're going to try to do that again and again and again. So we're actually going to be pulled towards the center. We're going to be pulled towards what an algorithm decides is going to be shown to the most people so they can make the most money on advertising. You're writing on an ad network. You're creating advertising inventory as the primary platform, the primary driver of your writing. I don't begrudge anybody who decides, I just need to write. I just want to self-express. Amazing. So many folks don't. They sit on their hands and don't ship a thing. But just know what you're getting into. You know, and the last thing I would say is, given that reality, that you're really constrained to one very narrow type of 280 character burst type writing, which I don't really know translates that well to other platforms, that you're kind of being pulled in the direction of the algorithm and what that deems as great. What ends up happening is you, in the words of David Bowie, you play to the gallery. David Bowie said, an artist should never play to the gallery. And what we are doing is fundamentally creating art, not painting, not sculpture, perhaps not even music. But art is something that you don't know will work ahead of time. But if it does, it will change people. It will have a profound impact on them. They will see the world differently. They will help themselves and those around them. It will resonate deeply. And when we optimize for reach out of the gate, we rob ourselves of the ability to refine our thinking around resonance, to think about what needs to be said, not what works when said. And we play to the gallery, right? He talked about, we do our worst work as creative people when we're just pandering all the time. You know, it's like all we want to do is rank on search. So it's like how to, question-based articles. You know, that's very limiting. So again, I don't begrudge people who do this. I just think we're like so enamored with it without knowing what it is. So if we walk in knowing that certainty or that truth, great, keep writing threads. For my money, it is pulling us in the wrong direction for most of our writing as a primary platform for it.
Fantastic. God, that was a gold mine of stuff to unpack. The one thing of the many things you said there, one thing that really stood out, I love this line. Is this original to you? Art is something you don't know will work ahead of time. Is that a Jay original?
No. God, I don't even know where I got that. I've heard Seth Godin say that before. I do admire, like Bourdain talks about this grand illusion of, you know, to expect that someone will stick around past the commercial or someone will buy the book is not rational thinking. And when you're doing these Twitter threads, it's all rational thinking. It's like, well, this is what works and how I can say it to trigger a reaction. And, you know, it's like, I'm writing in view of others. It's very performative. And don't get me wrong, I'm in the business of production. It's all performative. I want to implant a feeling or an idea in your mind. But I think it's the wrong type of performative. You know, drags us into a race to the bottom.
Yeah, and I guess I'm curious to how do you kind of parse there's obviously like on these extreme ends of the spectrum or whatever, there's like the writer who labors over a draft for 3 months and is tweaking every little comma and like is afraid to publish and, you know, eventually does, and it just gets indifferent, you know, crickets or whatever. And like, oh my God, all for nothing. And then the other end is obviously maybe tweeting 10 times a day, every asinine thought, seeing what gets an unusual number of likes and being like, all right, there's another clue for like where I should go next. And like, I guess, how do you, and maybe the more kind of fair gray area narrative that's more popular right now is like, hey, you need to be publishing often, and very often, like specifically on Twitter, because that's where you'll maybe are more likely to get some sort of engagement. You know, gauge the reaction you get on your work and use that to refine the direction. How do you kind of like incorporate feedback or the need to get some eyeballs on your work with how do you kind of balance, I should say, that set of incentives and that need with just like not slowly getting pulled into the mean and the average of content on Twitter? That makes sense.
Yeah. I don't know why it all has to happen on Twitter. I guess I'm a little confused by like why writing equals Twitter now. I think like the point, if we push aside the channels, the point is you do want to aerate your ideas publicly, right? Like I've developed a lot of podcasts for brands and everyone's like, I got this idea for a podcast. I'm like, great. First, write a very strongly worded tweet. Then if that resonates with like 2 people, 3 people saying like, hell yeah, why is no one saying this publicly? Write the blog post version. Like put a stake in the ground and be like, this is what the premise of the show will be. It's not going to be the show yet, but it's like, we can't stand that something in the status quo is broken. I see a mountain peak. That would be better. That's our vision for the future. Come with us. Right. And if people go, oh my God, yeah, I'm opting in, like subscription in the emotional sense, I'm aligned with your belief, I'm subscribed to it, not the button click sense, then great, you can continue. So I am a firm believer in you need to aerate your ideas. It's what public speaking is. Like I make a lot of my money through public speaking, and it's like being a stand-up comic. Like stand-up comedy is the original, the OG build in public, right? You're allowing the audience to be the arbiter of what you say, but your taste and your vision are still a part of that. And at the end of the day, if all you want is to trigger a laugh, you tell a bunch of fart jokes and you swear in an inappropriate time, like you are giving up any sense that like you matter in that creation. And a bot could have created what that was. And that's kind of how we operate when we operate on bot-driven platforms like Twitter. Your taste, your perception of the world, everything that makes you you makes the work an original and helps you say something that pushes people instead of panders to them. And so if you don't see yourself as someone in the change business, as someone in the emotions business, as someone trying to help people, that's fine. There are plenty of people out there who have figured out how to game systems to get quick injections of attention and sell their 10-step program for smash hit success in life. That's not me, and I wager that's not most people in Foster. So there's a big field between I'm going to write in a hole somewhere and get no audience, and I have to write native and primarily on Twitter. And it's right in that field that I think you want to calibrate and figure out what works best for you. So for me, it's all email. Newsletter drives it. Without the newsletter, I have no business. I'm also protected from the algorithm by bringing people off of platforms I don't own. My audience on Twitter is the largest by number and probably the most vulnerable. It makes my business vulnerable. So I need to bring people off of that because history is littered with these platforms screwing over creators. They don't care about you. You're not paying for their tech, so you're going to pay in other ways. So we have to be very careful when we publish natively. That does not mean we shouldn't aerate our ideas. So that we have to separate those two, aeration of the idea and where we primarily or natively publish.
Brilliant. I love that distinction. And actually, God, it's good on that rabbit hole. The one of the most interesting things with Foster so far to date has been like, we have an application process. So before someone joins us, they share a link to their blog or somewhere where they publish. And literally David, who's on the call, and myself go and read their stuff. And so I personally have read hundreds of applicants, just like skimming their blog, seeing some stuff they've written. And honest to God, one of the most fascinating takeaways, there's a bunch of obviously just brilliant people out in the world. And that's always a treat when you land on someone who's just clearly a seeker. But the other part is kind of like this dark realization, which is like, oh my God, so much of this feels like it was just copy and pasted from the last blog. It's, here, I always pick on this book only because it's so popular that I think everyone will know it, but it's like, here's how Atomic Habits like changed my life. I read it like 3 days ago. And like, I'm always like, why does everything feel so mimetic? Like these people have vastly different life experiences, or like very often have very different life experiences, very different potentially like perspectives and unique knowledge and all those sorts of things.
Yeah.
What is it that, I don't know, makes us feel this drive to be mimetic or write what's already popular? So leading into a question here, one, I guess generally is like, do you see a lot of that? Like maybe there's this mimetic desire a lot of us have that makes it tough to break out and do our own thing. And two is just kind of like, how do you advise or think about personally being willing to kind of go to the edge a little bit with ideas and like seek out new territory?
Right. So there's a danger here because you don't want to blend in. Everyone wants to stand out and do original work. I think we want to caveat that a little bit by saying, creativity is not pulling a stunt, right? It's not a stunt double for the real work. It is the real work. Like to try and be refreshing. People talk about in marketing differentiation and being different. Well, for the folks on video here, I could face backwards, or the next speech I give in the real world, I could walk up on stage and put my back to the audience and give a talk. I'm different. I'm also awful, right? So like the point isn't to just stand out. The point isn't to be different. It's to be refreshing. Because when you ask, I want to be different, you're asking an implicit question. Different from whom? The competition. Well, that's not the goal. right? Your goal is to serve the audience. So refreshing, I like better because it's refreshing to whom? The audience, and they're the arbiter. They decide. And so the reason we don't do that, perhaps, I mean, there's so many reasons probably, but one of the things I've recognized is, let me combine two things. First is what I'd call the tyranny of the correct answer. Like, we all grew up in the tyranny of the right answer, where we're in school. There's a right and a wrong answer. And momentarily, implicitly, and sometimes not so implicitly, if you get it wrong, you're ostracized. So we're like, oh, I don't like that idea. So we stop raising our hands when we're not 100% certain. And that goes on for years and years and years until eventually we're unwilling to try things that we don't know for certain will work. And that's why there's always a premium on the person who gets up on a stage or sells a book or writes a blog post that says, I have a simple secret to this. Like, if you just do this, there's always going to be a market for that until education changes. So there's this tyranny of the right answer. We've learned this sense of helplessness, and we need to break from it, quite frankly. How do we do that? That brings me to the second point, which is, I think the solution is not to pull a stunt. You know, you might say the solution is just years and years and years of shipping and getting to know yourself. But I think there can be a behavior change we can start to try, which might contribute or accelerate that journey, which is to make a switch from acting like experts to acting like investigators. Because experts care about the right answers in the absolute, in the generality. And that could be useful to a degree, but it's still missing variables. And in your work, the biggest variable that is like frustratingly present for any expert trying to figure it out once and for all is you. And so you're far better off, instead of looking for absolutes, looking for evidence. You're better off, instead of obsessing over everyone else's right answers, asking better questions. And so that's how I frame my work. It's how I was taught by very many great mentors. I don't like the way I feel about this stuff in marketing, or these ideas are underexplored, or quite frankly, I'm pissed off at something. And I'm like, that sucks. Why is it that way? It's broken. What would be better? I think that would be better. How do we get there? I don't know. Right. And this is where it breaks down. Well, I hope someone else publishes stuff about that. No, I want to do that. That's important for us to do that, to raise our hands and say, I have more questions than answers, and I'm going to investigate. I'm going to figure this out. Join us on this journey where every edition, every post, every newsletter, every episode, we're asking questions and finding answers. We're hacking through the jungle. And sometimes we're going to hack in the wrong direction. But I think that's a far more inspiring way to lead, to promote change in the world. And quite frankly, to like get past your own bullshit, where you're like, I can only draw on my expertise and experience. So I read Atomic Habits, and just like everybody else, but like my experiences are probably like everyone else. Here's my writing. It's far better to say, I'm really curious about this, right? I'm going to pursue it relentlessly, because your expertise is finite, but your curiosity is infinite. So that is fodder for originality if pursued relentlessly.
God, I love that. And there's also, there's also like this, almost like one just core belief that I operate under is like, oh my God, the world is so complex and changing so rapidly. So like, there can't even be that many experts on some level. Like, there's obviously a lot of nuance to parse there. And so I often feel almost like this natural skepticism if there's like someone has an extreme degree of certainty in a lot of their declarations, or like it kind of like turns me off. Whereas I love this idea of like maybe like asking better questions, instead focusing on asking better questions instead of trying to puff your chest and like have
totally
quote unquote best answer.
Yeah. I mean, everything, including everything I'm saying, should come with like a think for yourself clause. It's super easy to say. It's very hard to do. Right. But like what I love, my podcast is called Unthinkable, because when all you know is the best practice or the convention, the work that I profile, the stories I profile, they've done something that seems unthinkable, because like, the generality, the absolutes, you're thinking like an expert, but these people thought like investigators. And so it seems unthinkable until you hear their side of the story. Like, one of my favorite examples is this guy, Mike Brown, who runs Death Wish Coffee. It's the world's strongest coffee. I cannot drink it. When I did a shoot up at their office, they were like handing me, like, as soon as I would finish a mug, they'd replenish it. It's 2.5 times the caffeine of the average cup. So like, Mike is somebody who was making all these mistakes, running his coffee shop into the ground in upstate New York. And he sought out the expertise of people around him. And they all said the same thing. You're roasting Robusta beans. You need to roast Arabica, because it's the difference between like instant coffee, like powerful, but kind of like rubbery or grainy stuff, and like artisanal, wonderful, writer approved type coffee. I just want to sit next to some exposed brick and sip my Arabica coffee. But Mike looked at his customers and he was like, well, that's all well and good for most coffee shops, but we get mostly truck drivers and construction workers. And yeah, we get some entrepreneurs, but they're all hard chargers. They all want to relentlessly pursue their life and leave this world better, or at least go after their job or their project with reckless abandon. Like they want to work themselves to death. So that's what he sells, right? So he used Robusta, even though in general, that's a mistake. Why did he use Robusta? Because it's way more caffeine, right? That's what his customers wanted. So I love that story because Mike looked at probably the most common best practice in his space and was like, no, in my situation, that actually makes less sense. So it's not like he's a rebel for rebellion's sake. It's not like he's pulling a stunt to be like, we're the first or the only or whatever. He was very logically and carefully looking at his own situation and pursuing that. And that led him to make decisions that others deem as innovative or creative or even unthinkable.
God, that is an amazing story. I'm seeing so many parallels with these, a lot of other entrepreneurs and founding stories that I've always really admired for their willingness to just be different, coming from a place of conviction and coming from a place of knowing what they want to do. And one story, and I'll shut up, but the 5 Hour Energy story, if anyone knows it, is similar in that this guy was like, if I need caffeine, if I would just want a jolt of energy, I'm not also thirsty. That doesn't mean I'm also thirsty. Like I don't also want to drink a 12-ounce beverage. So like, why can't I just get the goods, rip it back in 2 seconds and call it a day? Like literally that's, these are two distinct challenges.
Yes.
Also, I don't want to go compete in a refrigerator. There's 15 other energy drink brands. It's like, screw this. I'm going to make an energy shot. I'm going to sit it right next to the cashier. And, a few $1 billion later, that was a very smart move. And
right.
I've always,
reasoning from first principles is a part of this. I'm sure people have heard that phrase before. We're all writers here. Why are newspapers 15-inch pieces of paper called broadsheet? Why? In the early 2000s, there was this British paper called The Independent that shrunk their pages to something called tabloid sheets, and they were pretty much ridiculed by all their peers. But what I found hysterical is that the broadsheet originated in the early 1700s in the UK because the government imposed a tax on publishers. And it was based on the number of pages in their print editions. So I say print editions like in the 1700s, there was another type of edition like digital. No. So because there was a tax on the page count, they just increased the sizes of their pages. So they could like print the same word count on fewer sheets and avoid the tax. Genius, right? In the 1800s, they repealed the tax, but by then it had kind of become this snowball effect where the best practice was to print a newspaper on broadsheet paper. So in the early 2000s, when the Independent shrunk their pages, they were ridiculed. But I'd ask you all fine people here, what's more ridiculous, like clinging to a convention born centuries ago based on a tax that no longer exists, or maybe thinking for yourself and questioning all that crap? So like there's this insidious force we deal with on social media called the algorithm. There's an insidious force we deal with in our work as creative people called the best practice, and they are worth understanding and questioning, not rejecting outright, but understanding and proceeding with that knowledge so we make better decisions, not like in general, but for us.
Incredible story. There's so much. I feel like every time I learn some bit of history, one of the big takeaways is just like how random and so much of what we take for granted today ends up being the root causes for a lot of things came from a place of intentionality 100 years ago, but just kind of Lindy effect, like stuck around. And now it's something we just all take for granted. So actually one thing Amanda shared a little bit earlier in the chat that I kind of liked, and there's a question here.
Sure.
It's like, she noticed some tweet the other day that kind of bugged her. So she started to journal it out. And she wrote, came from a bit more of a constructive place. And I'm putting words in your mouth, Amanda, but presumably like really was helpful in articulating what it is about the tweet that was irritating or she disagreed with or saw differently, which I feel like could lead to this clearer perspective on, what do I actually believe in? I'm a little bit more of a fundamentals first approach, but yeah, how do you encourage people to, identify the ways in which they see the world a bit differently, or to develop that practice of reasoning from first principles?
Well, my practice consists of two things. So one is my weekly newsletter, and I make an obligation to say it's a Friday morning newsletter. The obligation to other people, this like sense of service, helps me push through my own crap, and I have to write. And it didn't work out as I intended after a little while because life got stressful. I took on other projects, so I bumped up my scheduled writing time for that newsletter from like Monday, Tuesday to Thursday morning because I got to publish it tomorrow. And that's helped the practice a lot more. I write for others, but in a sense, I write for me. Like I got to interview on my show, Tim Urban from Wait But Why. And he talks about writing for a stadium of Tims. So that's how I view it. I write for a stadium of me. I am a participant in this community. And I think that's what great marketing is what great creative work does. It's about participation, not promotion. Because you're not actually part of that community. How the hell are you going to serve that community? So anyways, that's part of my practice. And the way I come at it, and I encourage others to look at this as a possibility, because there's a million ways to do it, is I get frustrated at stuff. That is the match that I can light endlessly, because I'm very frustrated by a lot of norms in especially the workplace. So the frustration is a match, which lights the kindling. That's curiosity, and then creativity is the fire, right? So frustration can lead to you ranting and getting disillusioned and checking out and being unproductive and destructive. Or it can lead to curiosity. Why is it that way? I can't stand this. What would be better? How do we get to the better? Who else is trying this? What forces are at play against and for? It's not enough to stand against something. You have to stand for something at some point. That's what a story is, right? The tension is in the middle. You have the status quo, the tension, and then the resolution. So what's your vision for the resolution? Now you're on the journey for that. So in my newsletter, for example, I take this as, this is my perspective on the frustrations I have. And right now the frustration is about this idea of the next rep in the creative process, where like, if my stated mission is to help people make what matters, why aren't they? Like, I'm frustrated that some people aren't. Well, there's enough folks addressing the getting started problem. I'm really frustrated by people who feel like they're stagnating, or they stop after they'd already started. And it's like, oh no, keep going. The consistency is what matters, right? Like the practice, keep going. So why do people stop? Well, we all have aspirations. We view creativity as too big. Let's take it back to the micro and the daily practice. Or we want to build a body of work. Well, what is a body of work? We talk about Ira Glass's quote, the gap, right? We have taste, which far exceeds our skills. So our work disappoints us. And the only way to close that gap is ship a lot of work. So you're going to build a body of work. Great. Well, what is that? Oh, it's just the sum total of tiny little movements forward consistently, the rep, whatever that means to you. So what if we could figure out how great creative people get to the next rep consistently, maybe faster, definitely improved? Are there heuristics and frameworks? Maybe. I actually don't know. It'd be great if there are. If not, I just have a bunch of cool stories and observations, and maybe that's the book someday. So right now I'm exploring the next rep, and I come at it from my weekly newsletter is my observation of the world, questions, comments, frustrations, anecdotes. And my podcast is others coming on. I'm getting other voices. And I'm like, yeah, you might be someone others have heard interviewed before, but I only want you to address this tiny sliver, this one theme, not your whole bio. But we're talking about recovery. Where is recovery in the role of a creator who ships consistently? I think it matters. I treat this like a physical fitness exercise. It's creative fitness. So what about recovery? Okay, well, the brilliant writer Margot Aaron is coming on the show, or came on the show. I'm editing that episode now. I could talk to her about a million things in her whole bio. No, we're just going to zoom into recovery and talk to her about that. She's a great representative of what we can learn about that theme. And so that's it. So it's from frustration to curiosity to creativity. It's shifting from I'm an expert to an explorer, and then using that as my identity as I ship, which actually evangelizes the cause, and it also brings more people in because I think it's very inviting.
Beautiful kind of demonstration of like this task of coming up with better questions. The recovery thing being a great example. Where does recovery fit in this process for creators, or why are people not getting to step 2 or staying consistent? I love that. It's like the answers could be different for every person, or there could be some commonalities, but the important thing is knowing where to look, and that comes through these great questions. So I love this, really catching on to this theme and really enjoying it. I guess if there's anything else on this topic, I welcome anyone to drop it in the chat, because I'm going to do maybe not a hard 180, but I'm going to do a turn here. So feel free to drop anything we've missed. But But one thing, there's two things we'll see if we have time for. But the first thing
Cool.
I was curious about is you've written a book, and I know it's
Mhm.
been a bit of time has passed or whatever. But I think that's something that's often like floating in the back of people's minds. Like, oh, that's kind of like the grand ambition for anyone who writes, is like you one day distill all your wisdom into a book. Maybe even the blog writing I'm doing, one day I'll round up the best of it, synthesize it, and put it in my tome that, people 3,000 years from now will be reading my insight.
Yeah.
As the book is the big project. What was, why did you write a book? And like, what was really the valuable part of that experience that stuck with you?
Sure. So I wrote Break the Wheel in 2018. It was published in the fall of 2018. I I wrote a book because I could no longer not. Does that make sense? Like when I write my newsletter or articles, it feels like I have these momentary like pauses in my breathing and I start to feel suffocated and I need to write so I could breathe again. Um, and but by the way, and some days not. Some days I'm like, I'm breathing just fine. You're telling me I got to write and all the other stuff I have to deal with today. And that's where it's like the practice, the scheduling, the muscle memory, the obligation, the journey I'm, on to explore the next rep and other themes. But for the most part, it was like, I just really wanted to write a book. And what I realized was I'd been sitting on a process that in retrospect makes a lot of sense. And so now it's the process I'm taking with this idea of the next rep. So the process was the podcast plus the newsletter, also public speaking. So if public speaking is like the best of the best ideas, frameworks, and the performance of things I'd been exploring in my newsletter and my podcast, I could bundle all three of those things, and that forms the spine of the book. And then I could round things out. So like, for example, Mike Brown from Death Wish Coffee. It's the lead story in my speech. It's the very first story on page 1 of my book. I need to get way more material. I need to look at the data. I need to look at a lot more stuff, the trends around Saratoga Springs, like Mike's assumptions that can I fact check them somehow? The economic diversity that he was describing, was that the case in the town around him? So you have to do more legwork, but I at least figured out like, these pillar stories and themes and insights and how to articulate them so they resonated because they were pressure tested. B, the kind of holes in my thinking and the stories I need to go gather. And C, and this is the most exciting part for me, the book became the culmination of a long journey with people like me who wanted to know stuff or change stuff and see the world like I do. It was like the capstone, this like little totem or artifact from a longer journey, instead of like, surprise, I went away for a while and now I have a book and now I got to go like find people to care about the book. So that all of that stuff happened by accident because I happen to be doing a lot of speaking, writing, and podcasting. And now I want to be intentional about it and see where it leads me. And that can be difficult because it could be like you're trying to manufacture it, right? So I've felt that. I've kind of been wandering a little bit since that book thematically until I just got back to frustration. Like, what am I most pissed at? Instead of engineering the results, let me find the pain that I feel and others feel and start there. And wherever it goes, it goes. Like, I can't get prescriptive about it. And I was trying to in the years following the first book as I try to get to the second one. And I feel like I've gotten back to just being an explorer for a little while, or being angry at stuff and trying to solve problems with story. So I know that's a lot. Your mileage may vary, but that process did work for me, and it had a lot of benefits, not only for the business, but also for the readership of the book. That's the point, is to get it into people's hands, not sell a bunch of books.
Yeah, I love this framing of it being the capstone for this longer journey. And there's actually some folks in Foster who have had their own book projects and a very similar feel to it, where it's like really this, without consciously working on it for years, they've been unconsciously laying the foundation for it.
Yeah.
And for some of them, it marked the close of a chapter and the beginning of a new one in their own life, where it was like, ironically, or maybe like, I'm going to publish this book on one topic, but actually I'm now ready to reset and
Right.
begin seeking again. So I love that framing and doing it, almost synthesizing it with your life instead of making it this distinct thing.
And I should add, I did a hybrid publisher, which I think is an important lesson for me. Maybe if others are interested, like, you can self-publish, which is you're doing all the parts and pieces. You can go to a big publisher, you maybe get an agent, but you're putting together a book treatment. You're hoping for an advance. Few people, if any, get an advance that makes any difference financially in their lives, which is another reason you can't just like go away for 6 months and explore and investigate and write, because you don't have the advance. By the way, it's an advance. It's like a loan. You're supposed to pay it back in book sales. I also love control more than anything creatively. So it's really difficult to go through a traditional publisher who's going to advise me on marketing when I know marketing, or who's going to own the rights to my book, or who's going to have a hold up when I say, I want my audiobook to sound a little quirkier, maybe more like a podcast, but definitely more impromptu. And they say, no, like I didn't want all that. I also had to have a tiny platform. So maybe they wouldn't have given me much of an advance or permission to publish with their label at all. So I didn't go traditional. I didn't go self-publish because I didn't want to learn how to package a book and distribute it. So I went hybrid, which is kind of like buying a used car. It's like there's some dollars you have to invest up front. And so for me, the saving grace was books get gigs. So I was able to get more speaking gigs, but also raise my rate with a book. It's like the best damn business card in the world. And also like help more people. Like I just felt like this is a thing I haven't done. And if I really truly have a mission and I'm really truly trying to serve creative people, this is one very obvious way I haven't tried to yet. I kind of wanted, it was like an investment in myself in a way for the very long haul. So that I went hybrid, which is I gave them a manuscript and a design from a friend, and I found my own editor, and they turned it into a book in all the, print, ebook, audiobook form that you need to, find on Amazon, for example.
Yeah, just to really clarify that you are essentially paying them to do those things for you. Do you retain 100% of royalties, sales, that sort of thing?
Yep, it's a flat fee. And yes, exactly right. 100% of the rights, any changes I want to make, the IP of it all, the content inside of it, it's all mine. Which also means the proceeds are too, which to me, that's negligible. I could buy a slightly nicer whiskey when I go back to a bar. I'm not going to buy like a nicer window for the house even. I'm a good selling author. And I'm kind of proud of it, to be honest.
That's awesome. I look good. That is an amazing tagline. I'm definitely stealing that. I'm a selling author. I've sold copies.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. So this leads into where maybe we'll wrap. I know we're coming up on time, and I'm going to end a couple minutes before the hour. So I vacate this office that I am temporarily occupying. So we talked before we jumped on, and actually Sarah, who's on the call, we've talked a lot about a lot of folks in foster, maybe writing is a solid number 2 in their life, and it supports all that the other things they do. They may be the founder of a cool startup. They may be a product manager at a big company. They have a busy day job, and writing is this, exercise in clarifying their thinking, building their communication skills. It's a creative outlet, but it may not necessarily be the thing that they want to do full time. But I think there's also folks who are actually it would be really interesting to write and create content and be, for lack of a better word, be a creator, and make money just from doing that. But where the hell do I start? What does that actually look like in practice? How do people actually make a living doing this? And so I guess leading to a question here, you mentioned maybe you've obviously learned a lot about doing this, and you've oscillated between working at companies, doing your own work.
Yeah.
But what are the, if someone was considering doing this, what are the pragmatic, practical ways that content, putting out creative work can actually be monetized and turned into some sort of living?
Yeah. I mean, the danger here is this is where I fell victim probably 2 years ago. You have a creative craft. You'd like to make money doing that creative craft. So then you do all kinds of things to make money that pull you away from the creative craft. And so that's why speaking was such a joy. And I say was because the pandemic obviously, moved that virtual eventually. It's kind of coming back as an industry. It's no longer the main driver of my revenue. And also on top of all that, I have a 3-week-old and a 2.5-year-old. So by the way, if I sound like I'm giving meandering answers, it's because right now I'm speaking to a room full of sea creatures. And also I think this coffee might have whiskey in it, and I don't know how it got there. So anyways, I think having speaking as a creative outlet and a moneymaker was a total gift and a total privilege. And I had very good mentors who helped me get into that. But one thing to watch out for is how you make the money, because you're thinking, I'm going to make money writing. The hardest thing in the world for me to do was to charge my audience directly for access to something I do already. And I still kind of don't do it. I dabbled in a course. I dabbled in an 8-week online cohort-based workshop. I mentioned the books. I've done an ebook you can also purchase about creating original content. And right now where I'm eyeing a movement towards is back to creating and getting paid to create. Can I create a membership platform or program where, yes, you get some exclusives, you get some live stuff from me, you get access to a community of creators, but more so it's like, I'd like to support the work that Jay's doing and also get some of the bonus stuff or original content that's only for members. Because that's how I identify. I identify as a performer, a creator, a storyteller. That delusion looms large, Bourdain of business. So the options are charge for being the Bourdain of business or trying to, or go find a larger organization or an organization that figured out the money side and try to link up with them. You know, he took his show to the Travel Network or was asked to make a show for them. And then he went to CNN. So to get started, I would say, if you really truly want it to be about the creative, the writing, not the independence, you need to charge for the writing. But if you're like, I just want to be an entrepreneur, great, because now the writing can fuel courses, live classes that become a course you sell. Like you get to use the IP of your writing to create a halo of products and or membership or community groups. So that could be fine. That's just not me. So I need to find a different way. So just be aware of which is you.
Yeah, I love the distinction because I think there's now a lot of folks are waking up, say, for example, with a course, that's a very operationally intensive undertaking, and like, marketing the thing already is this can be, I think, this Herculean effort, much less than going and delivering on it. So I think
oh my God, let's
I love
talk
that.
let's talk brass tacks, because that I think is a first step people go to is a
Yes.
course off of their creative.
Yes.
So I did this like website for a time called Marketing Showrunners, which was to teach marketers how to create great podcasts. That was my reaction. It wasn't proactive. It was a reaction to not having speaking anymore and having to figure out, what do I do? I'll educate people about doing things like I do with podcasts. Great. There's a market demand for that. Not at all the way I want to live my life or build my career, but I wasn't seeing clearly. I was panicking. This was at the beginning of the pandemic. So I started creating lots of content. Like, how do I codify and create frameworks for developing awesome podcasts for marketers? And I would see the reaction. So I'd pressure test all that content. And then I did an 8-week cohort-based course or a workshop where I was like live present doing all the work. Then I did a second session where I had more recorded videos to supplement my live stuff. And then I was like, I never want to do that stuff ever again. It's not what I'm here for. But I could take the best of the best and make a pre-recorded on-demand course and round that out with a few extra resources because I won't be there live. So I got to this place where my content actually fueled my course in a very harmonious way. But the biggest lesson of all, Stu, was I exhausted existing demand in my audience. I saved my year at the end of last year, sold a bunch of the course, sold a little bit in January, almost none in February. And so now the choice is, do I create another course, or do I become in the business of selling courses, all the systems and processes, right? So it still showed me I don't want to do this, but I learned a lot about when you make a course, mostly what you're doing is exhausting existing demand. It's not going to sit on the shelf and just sell itself.
Love that clarity, because I know there's a lot of maybe hype or excitement and probably this illusion or whatever. Even running Foster has been just very operationally intense, as anyone who's done like a paid community, which is similar in some regards to a course, can appreciate, where it's like, man, just delivering on this thing is like this huge suck of resources. And yeah, like you can soak up all the affinity you've already built. So
Yeah,
I love that it's kind of a leveling perspective on who this might actually make sense for.
yeah.
Well, I know we're coming right on time here, so I'm thinking about the best question to wrap on, and I think it'll be this. This will be a bit of a curveball, but what is something that you wish people asked you about more, or some topics that you'd love to speak more about, but aren't always given a chance?
I love that question. I'm so incredibly privileged in that I've slowly over time moved away from being like a content marketer or head of content at HubSpot or, VP of brand at NextView. And I'm like, people ask me about the work that I love doing every day. And we talk about the stuff that I love doing. It's incredibly, it's hard won. And I'm so hyper aware that I feel so privileged. So I don't know if I have something good to offer. I will say, I wish people would simply ask, that thing you did right there, how did that come together? And it's dangerous to go down that road sometimes because you're looking for like the exact process you went through. I'm going to steal it. But I like taking the things I've gone through or taking things others go through and dissecting the creative process. Because I think when you get to the micro, you hear people talk and explain things that seem obvious. And you're like, I could do that. Like when I start to wax eloquent about ideas, perhaps you're like, yeah, that sounds nice, Jay, but in my world, or, with my constraints. But when you talk about the making of something, especially something that feels a little bit out of reach for you, you realize like actually no single part of that was probably out of reach. Like there's maybe some outlier stuff that costs a lot of money, but mostly it's resourcefulness, not resources. And I think that brings creativity back from this glitz and glamour and influence and social media virality and all this crap we deal with back to the reality, which is like, show up, do a thing, show up again, do it a little different, do it a little better, and just keep showing up, right? Like none of the micro feels out of reach. So why don't we go chase and go build the things that we feel matter most to us and matter most to our communities? Like that's what we're here to do. We're not here to make some content. We're here to make a difference. And I think that's actually within reach.
Yeah, that is a beautiful, inspiring, and exciting note to end on. I'm now fired up. I'm like, man, I've got this backlog of shit I need to write now that I,
Yeah, don't go find, if you're watching this or listening to it, don't go find my stuff. Go make something. Like parlay that feeling into not subscribing to my stuff, but going and writing something. Like do that right now.
I love that, man. That is an amazing note to end on. And Jay, I mean, ironically, to contradict what you just said, where should people find you if they're not already following you? What's the best place to follow along?
To explore my projects and subscribe to anything, jacunzo.com. Lots of watching, listening, and reading there. To chat, to say something, and I promise I will say something back, is Twitter. So at Acunzo.
Amazing. I can say I am a happy reader of Jay's work and Twitter engager, and his stuff is awesome. And if this was any sampling of that, Jay is an incredibly thoughtful human being. So Jay, thanks for making the time, and everyone who joined. Amazing questions. The chat was hilarious. I had to withhold laughing at all these hilarious jokes and questions, but thank you everyone for joining. And Jay, thanks again for an awesome chat.
Thank you so much, Stu, and everybody, not only the people who attended live, but everyone listening and watching later. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Awesome. See y'all.